This session is called The Nature of Politics. So last session we talked about kind of what we see on the federal level as far as how it impacts Christian education. Try to give you our view of our work in the federal city, in federal law, about how the process, the topics, etc., impact Christian education. This is more of a, what's the structure that we should look at as Christians when it comes to politics? I know it's a fraught subject. When I was school administrator in Fort Collins, this is an illustration of how fraught it is. We had a missionary come in. I think he was going to one of the former Soviet bloc countries, right? So he's presenting his ministry. I'm going to go over, I think it was Romania, if I remember right. And, you know, he was just saying, these are some of the challenges we have in the culture over there. Being a former communist country and part of the Soviet bloc, this is kind of how people view things and how they... And so he's presenting it, and I was also over security for the ministry. And so I saw this man bolt stand up in his seat, you know, and I'm like, you know, is he going to charge the platform? You know, that's the first thing that comes to your mind. Because his body language is telling you he is not happy about something. So he stands bolt up, turns on his heel, you know, he's sitting right about here, stands up, turns around, walks down the aisle, and starts marching out. And so, you know, I slip you know, out with him and want to make sure he's okay, first of all. Hey, you doing all right? But, you know, the security side of me is saying, and make sure, like, you're actually going to your car and not to retrieve a weapon, something like that. And so as we're walking, I say, hey, are you doing all right, sir? Yeah, I'm fine. I said, is something troubling you? Are you feeling okay? Is something troubling? He's like, I will not tolerate a church talking about politics. I was replaying what the missionary was saying. I'm like, he wasn't talking... Just the fact that he identified that this was a former communist country and it had real impact or real effect on the people of that country, and that was going to be something he would have to keep in mind in order to administer or minister the gospel to them. That was considered a political statement to this man, and he was not going to tolerate the church talking about politics. To me, that's been an illustration of how some people think when you can hardly talk about anything if it has a political implication in church because somebody's going to be upset that you're preaching politics. Now, that's not to say that some churches, I think, are going astray in this. Some churches are preaching politics. So the dilemma comes in like, well, then how do we understand our role in a constitutional republic that has politics as an important part of daily life? How do we understand that role? And most importantly for Christians, how do we apply biblical thinking and biblical principles to that process? Because otherwise we just turn the ground, we cede the ground over to people that don't honor God in their thoughts, right? We turn it over to the people that will use politics to institute agendas that will force us into accepting living under laws that are completely opposed to the way the Bible commands us to operate. And so our religious liberty matters, and if we're going to protect it, we have to have an understanding of how to be involved in the political process, which means that we have to chance people thinking we're being political when we're being biblical. I think I said earlier, I think it was in my first session, that there's a difference between being political and having our government. There's a difference between Christians entering the political sphere to try to institute Christianity into society and government inserting itself into things that ought to be only God's realm. Like in Bible terms, we talk about it, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God. I was doing some research on this recently, and it's interesting. The three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, rehearse that story, right? That God's, you know, they try to trick them, they give them the coin, whose image is on it. Therefore, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, unto God. It's not recorded in John. So I've been thinking about this. Why isn't it recorded in John? Do you know the only mention of Caesar in John? Do you know where it is? So that story is not in John. So if you do a word search, Caesar, come up with the story in the three synoptic Gospels, but in John, not rehearsed. Do you know the only mention of Caesar in John? We have no king but Caesar. Interesting, isn't it? And so the people that crucified Christ, that gave assent to crucifying Christ, didn't understand some things are supposed to be rendered to Caesar, but other things are supposed to be rendered unto God. And they misunderstood that. And I think, my observation is that's what's happening in our politics right now. The people that are accusing Christians of being involved in politics are actually chanting, we have no king but Caesar. Because they want to be accepted into the culture and society. They don't want their life to be hard. And so their religious beliefs can shift, they can warp, they can adapt to accommodate the culture, to accommodate Caesar. Because it's a harder thing to say, Caesar, what you're doing's wrong. It's what John the Baptist did, Yeah, you have your brother's wife and God doesn't like it. Off with his head. That's the result of saying, Caesar, you don't belong here. This is a realm you don't own. Our country had that. The fundamental proposition of the First Amendment was that it is so important for every human being to be able to fulfill their obligation to their Creator that the government better not intrude into that obligation. That there was something about being human and being accountable to a deity after you died, that it was completely offensive for the government to get into the middle of that while you were alive. We don't have that anymore. In fact, religion is one of the... So civil rights legislation, I'm going to caption this civil rights legislation. Civil rights legislation came about because we have a history of racist discrimination in our law against blacks. Okay. And so in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of discussion, how do we cure this sin? How do we cure the original sin of chattel slavery and racial discrimination that has characterized some of our country? And it was, okay, well, we need to think about how a person lives in freedom, where the law has legitimacy and when the law doesn't have legitimacy. And they came up with this idea, there are certain things that are so unique and fundamental about us as humans that we should never be discriminated against. We should never not be able to live in freedom because of those things. And what were they? They were race, skin color. They were national origin, where I was born. They were age. I can't help that I'm 51 years old now, right? I can't help that, so I shouldn't be discriminated against. It was sex, maleness or female. I can't, of course, now today you can, right? This is one of the problems. What do we mean by the word sex in federal law? Because if you can become a woman, what does sex even mean anymore? But that was understood as innate characteristics of our humanity. Do you know what the other one was? Religion. In our modern sensibility, let me ask you this. Which one of those seems more flexible, more adjustable, more driven by my opinion than my innate character? Do you understand that the founders thought that your religion was more than I go to the Baptist church on Sunday morning? Your religion was my fundamental obligations to the spiritual being that made us and that I will be accountable to someday for my eternal bliss or punishment, my eternal happiness or condemnation. And so when the founders talk about religion, they don't just mean my denominational preference for where I go to church. They mean my fundamental obligations as a human to live my life in the physical world looking to the world to come. And there's no higher identity if you see the world that way. A friend of mine that works for the Christian Legal Society, CLS, she says most of the people in our society and especially our government today don't understand the idea of commandedness. They don't understand that as Christians we are commanded to do things a certain way. People used to understand that, and they used to say, well, listen, don't get between a person and their God, especially if you're in government, because then you might be accountable to that God for what you stopped a person from doing, for fulfilling their commandedness, their obligations. Does that make sense? All right, so that's where the idea of religious liberty comes from in the United States, that there was something more at stake than the law. There was some eternal obligation that every person had, and they should be able to live that out freely without the government telling them what to do. We no longer have that in the United States. The government thinks, well, just change your religion. Just change your opinion about that. What big deal is it? You're a nun? Listen, we think everybody ought to have contraception as part of their health care. Yes, but we're nuns. We have a vow of celibacy. It doesn't matter. You still have to buy health care. But our money then will be used to provide abortion for other people. We'll put our money into a big pool, and you'll take that money. What we'll do is we'll have a separate fee. You won't pay that fee, but it'll still be an obligation. No, we can't do that because that money is fungible. How are you going to know that just that dollar is you? Well, okay, fine. You have a religious, just sign this paper saying you have a religious conscience against it, and then you'll be free. You can wash your hands of it because you've signed a paper saying, I disagree with this and I don't want. And they said, no. The law itself is immoral. By the way, they were all, this is Little Sisters of the Poor. They've been to the Supreme Court 3 times in the last 10 years because the government continues to harass them, trying to get them to pay for abortion in their health care plans. And kudos to them. They keep saying, no, we ought to obey God rather than man, and what you're telling us to do is immoral, and we won't do it. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of what we're talking about when we talk about the context in which we're going to talk about political engagement, that we as Christians have a birthright in America to make sure that our government keeps itself restrained to the things that Caesar is responsible for, and we have to be free to give our obligation to fulfill the commandedness that God has given us in everything else. And so it's not our fault that government now is treading on all of these things that it has no place to be. All right, so what stops then Christians from being involved in politics? We're going to go through a few things that I think is a tongue twister, but perceived problems preventing political participation. Say that 5 times fast and I'll give you a piece of candy. Perceived problems with political participation. We're going to call the first one, oh, by the way, I owe a lot of credit to a man named Jeff Myers for these ideas. I've elaborated on them, expanded them, but originally I got these ideas from a man named Jeff Myers. He's with Summit Ministries out of Manitou Springs. Highly recommend their materials to you. They do a lot of Christian worldview instruction, very helpful resources. And so the first excuse is a spiritual excuse, right? So we have the spiritual excuse. It's common to hear this idea. We need to change hearts, not laws, right? Okay, this is very common in the abortion issue, right? We just don't want to make abortion illegal. We want to make it unthinkable. I agree. But until that time, is it really true that God cares about hearts but not politics? It is true that a person with a changed heart will think differently about what they ought to do. When we submit ourselves to the commandedness of God, when we say, oh, okay, God, you're my creator, what do you want me to do? The right action results from that, right? We say, okay, if that's what God or you say, then I'm going to commit my life to doing that. We shouldn't be, we can't be willing to wait for hearts to change before laws protect the unborn. In other words, we have the right to say, no, the law should be what is true. The law should be what is good. The law should punish evil and protect good, and we have an opinion from our Creator about what is evil and what is good. And we expect our law to be respectful of that. Elizabeth Hasselbeck is one of the most famous illustrations of this. She was, remember, one of the quote-unquote conservative commentators on the wonderfully entertaining show The View. Have you seen it? And they were having a big discussion about abortion, and she said, listen, change a law or change a heart? I'd rather change a heart. Can I just say that sounds spiritual, but it's not practical, it's not workable, it's not true. Because this is the truth. God cares about both. Psalms 24:1. I don't think you can get a more comprehensive statement than this. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and all that dwell therein. When we say you shouldn't murder babies, it's because there's a creator God that has an opinion about a baby. and about what that is. Does that make sense? Because the world is the Lord's, everything in it. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether therefore you eat or drink or whatsoever you do all to the glory of God. Christians are commanded to do this. That's a pretty comprehensive list, or whatever you do. And then my favorite quote on this idea is from Adrian Rogers, a famous Baptist preacher. He says, it's inconceivable that God would ordain government. By the way, where did God ordain government? This is a good government question, government teacher question. Where do we point to as Christians in the Bible about the legitimacy of government? Because right now, there's a libertarian streak in our country that says government itself is illegitimate. We don't need government. We just need contract law. We need to be buying and selling with each other, and we'll have peace. I don't think it's real. It's almost as utopian as Marxism, right? It's almost as utopian as Marxism. If we just let people conduct their normal business, we won't have to have government telling us what to do. So where do we get the idea of the legitimacy of government? Genesis where? 6. What's the circumstances? Noah. It is Noah. I think it's 9. It might be 9. Yeah. Where God says, if man sheds blood, by man shall blood be shed. Now, think about this. So before the flood, God records for us that the thoughts of the intents of their heart were only evil continually. Who was responsible during that time for restraining the evil? If someone murdered, who was going to take care of that before the flood? Vengeance. Maybe a father? Maybe the patriarch? In that situation, would you have, something like negligent homicide? One son kills another son because he accidentally was being foolish, right? They were goofing off. They were chopping trees. And, he said, hey, run through there quick. See if I... Tree falls and kills him. Would there be anything such as negligent homicide, do you think? No, I don't think so. It'd be like, okay, I got a dead son. You have a dead son now. And maybe you have 2 dead sons to teach you a lesson that you should have trained your son better. You would have had vengeance. You would not have had justice. I think that's one of the reasons why the earth was so wicked. There was either fathers that did not avenge evil. They couldn't tell that. Oh, by the way, let me take a step back. If your son did the killing, would you want him punished at all? Oh, it was just a mistake. Why you guys, listen, accidents happen. I'm not going to punish my boy. Your boy should have been smarter. He was the dummy that walked in front of the tree. Do you see what I'm saying? It would have been really hard to have a detached view of the right and wrongness of any situation. Family loyalties or family hatred, you'd have had the Hatfields and the McCoys all over the place. Mafia, that might be a good illustration of it. Oh, this is for what it's worth. If you're ever arguing with somebody about the Old Testament, how brutal it was, and they say, an eye for an eye makes both people blind, you remind them that that was a limiting law, not a permission law. It was a law that says, listen, don't take 2 eyes for somebody else that only took 1 eye. So people present it today as it's some sort of, those backwards primitive people poking eyes out, cutting off hands for doing. No, God was instituting limits on human vengeance because that's our tendency. I'm a justice person. I think, Pastor Jake, what you said, I was a criminal justice major in an education, undergrad, criminal justice, master's degree in education. It produced some interesting conversations with parents when they would come into my office to interview for the school, and I'd get a dad. He'd be looking at my degrees on the wall. You got to hang them up there to make sure they know you're legitimate. As an administrator, I'm not just some homeless guy they pulled off the street and put behind the desk. And I'd get dads occasionally say, criminal justice and education? And I'd say, oh yeah, they're the same fields. And if the dad laughed, I knew we had like a similar view of children. If he didn't laugh, or if, the mom clutched her pearls, not my Johnny. I was like, oh man, we might have some trouble. It's going to be fun. No Johnny. Yeah. Because I'm a justice person. My personality is justice. Do you know the Bible says, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly? Do you know what my sinful, prideful temptation is on justice? Is vengeance. By the way, do you know what a merciful person's temptation is? Appeasement. And so God steps into that and says, listen, man has been really evil. I've had to destroy them by the flood. He gives some of his sovereign right as the creator to other men to take the life of men when murder happens. That's the basis of all human government. And so God cares about law. He cares about restraining evil, punishing it. Romans 13 tells us a more elaborate, that he carries the sword, that there should be a reward for those who do right. In America, that reward is the government leaves me alone and I get to work with my own hands in the way God has designed me, built me, called me, put into me a love of whatever I do, and the government doesn't take it or tell me what I have to do with it. That was how our founders decided the good would be rewarded, was that every man could benefit from his own produce. George Washington, his favorite verse, if you go to his home in Mount Vernon, which I encourage you to do, his favorite verse was, everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree in peace. In other words, they'll have the produce of what they produce with their own hands, and the government will leave them alone. Because God cares about law, cares about the restraining of evil, the rewarding of good. All right. What's the next excuse? The prosperity excuse. I don't find people offer this, although sometimes they do. But this is more along the lines of, listen, you know what? I've heard all these predictions about all these things for years. Government was going to do this or not do it. You know what? My paycheck's okay. I got a boat. I got some nice things in life. You know what? I'm just going to disengage. I'm not even going to be involved. It's a kind of a selfish thing. I encountered this a lot with people who say things, and again, forgive me if you say this, I'm not making any absolute statement about what you have to do is, I don't even watch the news anymore, it's just depressing. Those people are all corrupt, so I just don't even care anymore. It's the disengagement from what's happening politically because it's discouraging or frustrating or complicated, or I've got better things to do. Why is this so devastating? It's because prosperity doesn't last forever. Prosperity comes about from following the order that God put into the universe. And we live in a time in life where people don't believe objective truth even exists. It's not that they don't believe in God. They don't believe there's any absolute truth that people have to follow for success. They believe we create reality by the laws we make. So, if the law says you have to call someone by their pronouns, then that's the reality. If they say they're a woman, they're a woman. And so, if Christians leave the political landscape because, listen, I'm fine, why worry? Then the only people making decisions don't hold the correct view of reality. And we're seeing that come to fruition. You ever met a trust fund baby? You ever heard about a trust fund baby? You know what a trust fund baby is? It's that person whose parents made a lot of money, left it to them, and all they're doing is spending it up. Well, what's true with money is true also in society. We have a moral heritage that's been built up by previous generations that create the prosperity that we have now that we're spending up at a rate way faster than it's being put back into society. It's why we see the breakdown of marriage. It's why we see the breakdown of our institutions. It's why we see failure all over our society, because we're losing the capital, the moral, the ethical, the social capital that our politics used to build up, that used to protect. And now it's letting everybody spend those things like the prodigal son, as profligates. And so if people don't get re-engaged and re-involved to put back into society the things it takes to be prosperous, we won't be prosperous anymore. What's the phrase that's been going around right-wing Twitter lately? Hard times create good men create easy times create bad men, something like that. It's this cycle. That's what we're talking about. In the prosperity excuse, we have to be determined to understand where that prosperity comes from. Our democratic Republican system requires it. Listen, the system of government we have requires us to be involved. We talk about self-government. It was this revolutionary idea. Mankind, because he was accountable to God, we should be very careful about making him accountable to a monarch, because that monarch might be corrupt, and it would be a great offense to God. Because we're made in the image of God, we have the rationality, we have the ability in order to order our lives as we see fit. And so we should be responsible then for deciding who rules over us. It was a revolutionary idea at the time. It's a beautiful idea. But that idea requires, as John Adams says, a moral and religious people. Or else it can't work. It won't work. It's like trying to fly an airplane without fuel. Eventually gravity takes over. And so we've got to counter this in our own lives and be encouraging to other people who say, listen, I don't know if I care. All the predictions I've heard about communism coming in the United States doesn't matter. I loved Matt Walsh. Matt Walsh was asked recently by people who are advocating for this idea of trans identity. He's got some masterful back and forths with people putting forth this idea that humans can create whatever reality they want. And often they will say, why do you care so much? Why do you care about this? Like, you don't have a trans kid, so why do you even care? Why are you so focused on other people's sexuality? Are you some sort of pervert? Sometimes they'll be very creative in how they make it out like you're the person with the problem because you care about so-called transing kids. He said this, I care about truth. I care about children who are having this lie foisted on them. And I care about the women who are being denied the opportunities that are rightfully theirs. Can I just tell you that's a Christian perspective? In a sense, I don't have to have a personal stake in any issue.
Who are you quoting?
Matt Walsh. He's a commentator. He came to a lot of notoriety on Dr. Phil, believe it or not. He argued against people that were arguing that our law ought to accommodate trans identity. Non-binariness, like, I have to talk about things in my daily life that 10 years ago we would have blushed. I was in a meeting with 3 senators and values groups, so a bunch of values groups. There were about 25 of us in the room talking to 3 senators about some of these important issues. And one of the gals from, I can't tell you where she's from, it's an off-the-record meeting, but I can tell you this. So one of the gals that works in one of the pro bono legal organizations, there's been a number of legal organizations that have sprouted up to protect Christian belief. ADF would be one of those. We partner with ADF for religious liberty. We work a lot with them in Washington, D.C. on these issues. She wasn't from ADF. She was from another organization. She started talking about a case that they were involved in where upper elementary students were taken to camp by, you have to do mental gymnastics even to keep track of this stuff. They were in the public school. These children were taken to camp. It was an environmental stewardship camp. It was a climate change camp, right? So these upper elementary kids are in an overnight camp with a teacher who is a woman that now thinks she's a man. And so the school didn't discriminate against her. They let her change her identity. And now she's responsible for 5th and 6th grade boys in an overnight camp. And she's in the cabin with them, and she has to monitor their shower usage to make sure that they're being appropriate with the resource of water. And so this family finds out after the fact that this is going on and sues. Another situation out of Colorado is, I think, again, younger kids. A girl, 4th or 5th grade, 6th grade, something like that, overnight trip, and it's a young boy the same age that is a girl, and they don't tell the girls that this young boy thinks he's a girl until their overnight stay, and they start to change for bed. Sleeps in the same bed as the young girl. Parents find out after the fact, go to the school, and they say, you're a bigot for even having a problem with it. That's a girl. You have no right to be upset about this. They sue. So this young lady's talking about these cases that they're involved in, and she just she does one of these. She's saying, and then the boy is a girl. I'm sorry. We used to be embarrassed to have to talk about these things in such detail. She said, 10 years ago, we would have blushed to say all the things we have to say in public now. Because Christians have left the political arena many times because they haven't fought. Our prosperity has hidden the realities of the political environment we're in. I think it was the last Obama election. Was that against Romney? He ran against Romney last time, right? Yeah. I think it was something like 40 million self-identified Christians didn't vote in that election. 40 million of them. And I can't remember if they were registered or could have been registered. I don't remember all the nuance of it. I just remember the number 40 million. Because Christians break pretty reliably, Republican and Democrat, 80-20, pretty reliably. If those 40 million had just taken civic responsibility to vote their conscience, if they wanted Obama to win, they should have voted for Obama. If they wanted Romney to win, they should have voted for Romney. If they would have just voted, Romney would have won in a landslide. You probably heard last week, I think, Barna, who is a famous researcher of Christians, said that this election, about 36 million Christians are not going to vote. 51% of self-identified, and you know, the devil's in the details with polls, right? So you got to dig in deep. But it's fairly good methodology. I think self-identified Christians that attend church over some period of time. So not just people that say, oh yeah, I'm Christian, but never go to church. It's people that go to church over some period of time, identify as a Christian. Are you going to be involved in this next election? 51% yes, 49 said no. The no people are about 36 million people that aren't going to vote. Our prosperity has blinded us to the necessity of Christians having a voice in our political process. I would say this, I hope it's not too dogmatic a statement, but not to be involved, I think, is to disobey God's command to obey those that have the rule over you. The citizen is sovereign. To not take responsibility for that sovereignty, I think, is a dereliction of our duty as citizens of the United States and citizens of heaven. And this is the bottom line truth. If Christians leave the political arena and discussion, other worldviews are going to dominate. If Christians don't have our say in a free society, then other worldviews will dominate. The next excuse is the moral excuse, and this is powerful, right? I won't sully myself by choosing the lesser of two evils. A couple of thoughts about this. First of all, there's a lot of wrong assumptions in this way of thinking. I've already said it, maybe not in this session, but maybe in the previous session. There's more to politics than the vote. When I first came to this position in Washington, D.C., I got a call from the White House, which, you know, when it comes up on your phone, you're like, ooh, the White House. Yeah, I'm special. But it's some low-level person at the White House. You know? And they're probably not even in the White House. They're in the Eisenhower building, which is next to the White House, that they call the White House. But it's still cool, right? When the White House comes up on your phone, you're like, ooh. And Mr. Coppola, yes. As a representative of AACS, we'd love to have you come and stand behind the president. I don't know if it was in the Oval Office, but that would have been cool, while he signs this important piece of education legislation. It's like, oh, nice. What's the legislation? Oh, it is, and they begin to tell me about a piece of legislation. I'm like, no, we don't support that, so thank you. Very kind of you to consider us. I don't think we'll be able to attend. Okay. Because their agenda, their goals were not our goals. The people that I had to work with in the Obama administration, when you tell them this is bad for Christian education, they'd be like, it is? Okay, we're going to get right on that. And not because they wanted to make it better for Christian education. They view Christian education as a threat to public education. They view hurting Christian schools as helping society. They're worried that we're subversive. And in a sense, we are. Because we have obligations to God and not just to Caesar. And they want everybody just to feel an obligation to Caesar. And so when you elect a president, he brings about 4,000 positions with him. Those are the people I work with behind the scenes. And so a better way to think about this is the vote is not all you're doing in politics. You're setting up people in the administration that are either going to have more of your worldview or will be influenced by you. They'll listen to you and say, oh, how can I help you with that? I sometimes contrast this with Betsy DeVos. When I sat down with Secretary DeVos, we invited her to speak to our National Legislative Conference. She and I were going to do an in-person interview. I was going to ask her questions about things she was going to answer. So in our pre-meeting, we sit down in her office and she looks at me and says, what can we do to help Christian schools? What can the Department of Ed? And I'm like, oh, excuse me, what? Caught me a bit flat-footed. Like, okay, I have a secretary, the Secretary of Education, asking me, what can we do to help your Christian schools? Completely different feel from the bureaucrats and the leaders under the Obama administration. Again, I'm not saying anything super political. I'm just saying this is my reality. I have people that have a different worldview that I have to talk with after one election than people with a different worldview than I have in another election. When the Republicans are in Congress, when we ask to have a briefing in the White House for our National Legislative Conference, they say, absolutely, let's try to work this out. When we ask for that in a Democratic administration, they say, I think we're busy. So you need to think about the electoral process as not just the vote, but who can you have more influence with once they are in office? Who will do more good than evil once they're in office? And that leads me to the other point on this. In a fallen world, human action cannot be entirely free from evil. To me, this is a very weighty idea, right? Because it borders on saying, well, we just never know if what we're doing is really good, like a kind of a relativity, like moral relativity. I don't think that's I know that's not what I'm saying, and I think the idea is still solid. I'll go to Paul then. Paul in Romans chapter 7, verse 21, he says this, I find then a law. What's this law he's talking about? By the way, Romans is always talking about the law of God written on our hearts that even the heathen, the Gentile, know, and they suppress it. But sometimes they do by nature the things contained in the law and become a law unto them. You understand what he's building this case that there's a law written on our heart because God as the creator has put a bit of himself, his image in us. And so we know the truth. Okay, so that's what he's saying. So then Paul says, I find then a law that when I would do good, evil is still present with me. Can I just tell you that's the humble position that we find ourselves in? When people ask Alexander Solzhenitsyn, this man that fought against the evils of communism, that became a Christian in prison because he saw the Christians were better at utopian living than the communists were. The Christians were better at sharing all their resources unselfishly than the communists were. And he said, there's something to this Christianity. That Alexander Solzhenitsyn. When they asked him, where is evil in the world? What's wrong with the world? Do you know what he said? The line dividing good and evil doesn't extend through nations or people. It extends through every human heart. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that we should be honest with ourselves and humble enough to admit that when I told you I'm a justice person, when I, in a moment of great charity and mercy in traffic in the morning when I'm trying to get into the office, when I, in a moment of great magnanimous spirit, let the guy who raced down the left-hand lane, knowing he had to merge and was trying to cut the line, when I say, you know what, buddy, you just merge right in. And I pat myself on the back for not pinning myself to the bumper of the car in front of me and staring at him like, yeah, you just try to get it. Yeah, you get it. Because that's my temptation. When I feel like I was merciful, do you know what the guy behind me is saying? You idiot! What are you doing? Don't you see that guy knew he had to get... I was unjust to everybody behind me, but I forget about that because I feel I was pretty merciful for letting him in, right? And isn't that true about us? That try as we might to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly, I have a hard time knowing whether my actions have achieved that. And so in politics, it's especially true. I mean, we're in a time period of great propaganda. We're in a time period where it is hard to know the reality of what anybody says. And so what we need to do is be as informed as we can be, choose the best candidate we know, and not on the basis of, well, I won't choose evil, but on this basis. God tells us that we are to overcome evil with good. Doing good in this world never never crushes or destroys evil. That's not going to happen until Christ comes to rule and reign. So at best, what we're left with right now is where will the most good be done? How will evil be overcome by good with my decision politically? I don't know. Sometimes it's a tight decision. You know, if we were doing just the percentages, and I were to say to you, what percentage of one thing overcomes another thing, what would you say? 51%, right? Or 50.1 if you're really technical, or 50.1111 or 0.0001. Right? Sometimes the difference between what is evil and what is good is a really close call. I think that's probably true in this election, just to be honest. The candidate I prefer is Donald Trump, not because I think he's so virtuous. You know, I say this, you know, if he were in our churches, if he were a member of your church, Pastor Jakewith, he would either have to be under discipline or discipleship, right? There's no two ways about it, right? Because as an individual, he's fraught with moral problems. But in my heart, I think he will do more to overcome what I think is objectively evil. He will protect more babies' lives. He will protect more children from being subjected to sexual identitarianism. He will let people who work hard to earn their money to take care of their families keep more of that money. For me, the choice is, and I'm not trying to impose this on you. You have to decide yourself. I'm saying the object has to be, instead of, I won't sully my hands with choosing the lesser of two evils. I think the Bible doesn't teach us to think that way. The Bible teaches us to think, if I'm going to engage, how can the most good come out of this situation? Because we live in a world where sin touches everything. It even touches my heart. And so the right way to think about it is to not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Destroying evil is God's job. Our job is more accurately contained in Jesus' words to his disciples. You remember when he's about to leave, and they're saying, hey man, don't leave us. We need you here. He says, I have to. I'm going to pray that the Father keeps you from the evil one. And now what do? Occupy till I come. In the prayer that he teaches us as his disciples, he says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. In every area of our lives as Christians, we're supposed to make that area look as much like we know about God's kingdom as we can. In our family, it means if I have responsibility, my family should look like as much of the kingdom of God as I can make it. In spite of the sin that I have, in spite of the sin my wife has, in spite of the sin that my daughter has, I am supposed to be striving for that to look like God intends. And the same thing's true in our society, in our political involvement. All right, so the helpless excuse then, so that's the evil excuse. The helpless excuse is one person's action doesn't matter. I love this. If you look through the scriptures, this is pretty interesting. This hit me several years ago because a lot of what we see in D.C., we want global solutions. We want things that are marketable and scalable. I met with the Gates Foundation several years ago, and they wanted to know, how do you guys do education so well? Like 95% of your graduates go on to college. I said, yeah, but that's not our goal. What? How do you get kids to college? Well, we just tell them essentially, be what God made you to be. I told them this. I said, it's more holistic for us. We like to treat the whole child. You know? Because what did they want? They wanted scalable solutions. They wanted to know what Christians did that they could scale so they could give billions of dollars to public schools to get kids into college. And I said, that's not our goal. Our goal is not to get kids. Well, then how do you do it? We tell them, be all you can be. We tell them if God has that plan for your life, you ought to develop your talents and your skills so that you can live out God's calling in your life. That's all we tell them. And then if they can, they do. So we don't make it our goal to get them to college. Because the world is looking to love the world. God doesn't tell us that. He said, that job's too big for you. Leave that to me. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten. Do you know, I can't see anywhere in Scripture where God tells me to love more than my neighbor. That's it. And, you know, when people try to trip them up and say, well, who's my neighbor? Like, you see that guy in the gutter right next to you? Yeah, so why don't you start with him? For us, it's our family. We had a benevolence case in church last week, and those are hard. Somebody comes and we've never seen her before. She's passing through town, has a kid, she says, didn't meet the kid. I need benevolence, right? Hard situation. Like, okay, how do we be the church to this woman? We have to kind of try to find out how we can best help you. How do we love you as our neighbor? You know what the first questions I asked? Do you have family in the area? You know why? Because the Bible tells us, listen, you know what? Your family's your neighbor. By the way, it's a good lesson to tell kids. When kids get all grumpy about their parents telling them what to do, you tell them, you know who God says that is? Your dad's your neighbor. You're supposed to love him. Because there's a pattern in Scripture where God says, love those people that are close to you first. Take care of their needs. Show your love by providing for them. A man that doesn't provide for his family is worse than an infidel. A widow that has sons better take care of her. And if she doesn't, then the church can step in. And you might even make an argument that, government has some role for a safety net in that. I don't think there's an absolute truth about, well, if this person doesn't have a church or doesn't have family, then maybe government has a small role to protect them from absolute poverty or death because they can't be sheltered. But where does God start? He starts right close next to us, the people that are closest to us as our neighbor. And so, sometimes the world even gets this right. They'll say things like, all politics is local. So my encouragement to you is start small, let God work. Bonhoeffer's a great illustration of this. He said, Bonhoeffer was the German that went back to Germany. He actually was arrested by Hitler and hung with piano wire 2 weeks before Hitler took his own life in the bunker. Bonhoeffer is reported to have said, some people have said this, he never said it, but he certainly lived this way. This is the testimony of his life. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. We know this as Christians. God never calls us to our definition of success. He always calls us to faithfulness. That is God's pattern throughout Scripture. Listen, love your neighbor, do what's right, and let me take care of the results. And so we shouldn't feel helpless. I grew up in Massachusetts, another coastal liberal place. And I saw my parents faithfully vote when they knew there was not a chance that person was going to win the election. I remember when Reagan won, I was a kid, I was like, what? We voted for someone who won an election? Are you kidding me? I felt like I'd won the World Series or something. But that testimony of faithfulness from my parents, I think is in part of what prepared me to do sometimes the work that we have to do in politics, where it doesn't look like we're going to win. But our job is not to win. Our job is to do what Scriptures call us to do. In this case, I would say be involved. Be involved politically and see how God works. How much time do I have? I can wrap up here if I need to.
1 minute.
I have 1 minute. Hey, perfect. Any thoughts, comments, questions before we go? Any additions, clarifications?
When I was in high school, I came to the realization that Roe v. Wade was able to take purchase because people of the greatest generation left politics.
Mm.
And from that point on, I ordered my life, and I've held a few political offices and everything like that, but I felt it was my Christian duty to prevent disaster like Roe v. Wade.
Well, that would, I think, go to the point we made about prosperity. I mean, the 50s were a very prosperous time for our country, 50s and 60s. And out of that maybe came some lethargy on previous generations. Who can blame them? I mean, they gave their blood to protect liberty. If anybody has an excuse to say, I need a little break, it might be that generation. My generation doesn't have an excuse. Yeah, good point. Any other thoughts?
You mentioned earlier about not being prepared for the Dobbs decision.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on what would have better?
So there was a huge fight. I think was it the Mississippi Attorney General? I think it was the case came out of Mississippi. The Mississippi Attorney General said, I'm going to argue, because you have to decide how you're going to argue a case before the Supreme Court. She decided she was going to argue for the complete overturning of Roe, and the pro-life movement said, no, we're not ready for that. The Supreme Court will knock you down, and you'll set the movement back 20 or 30 years. So the conventional wisdom was society wasn't ready for this. If we overturned Roe, we couldn't overturn Roe. It wasn't that if we did. We couldn't overturn Roe. But that began to reveal a blind spot in the professional advocacy class for pro-life movement, that they were not thinking beyond what would happen if Roe were overturned. And the Mississippi Attorney General, through what many people perceived was a Hail Mary, because she said, no, it's the right thing to do, and I think it's the right time. I'm arguing for an absolute overturning of Roe v. Wade, and she won. But there was no strategy about how do we legislate in the absence of Roe v. Wade. We had become so used to that being the status quo of our law that we had not thought strategically about how to. It's impossible right now to pass a national abortion law. You've seen Vice President Harris saying she will get it done, but in the opposite direction of what pro-life people want, to the point where she said she wouldn't allow religious objections to a federal law. On the right, back to, I mean, maybe something somebody said, I can't remember. On the right, a lot of people claim to be pro-life, but they like the fact that you can have an abortion. So there's a huge disagreement about what the solution is. So now you have, I think, Arizona and Florida are two of the most conservative states that are voting on constitutional amendments that will absolutely prohibit regulation on abortion in those states. Florida has, right now, it's polling at 60% approval. So you may have a very conservative state in Florida that has no restrictions on abortion anymore because the people amended their constitution on it. So that's what I mean, we were not ready. Ohio passed a constitutional amendment that actually people predict will open the door to child sex changes because of the way it's worded, that on a basis of sexuality, not on the basis of human life, that it will actually open the door to child sex change operations as reproductive health care. So, in other words, I can alter my natural reproduction, and the law, the constitutional amendment in Ohio will say you can't stop people from doing that if that's what they agree with their doctors. So that's what I mean, we were not ready for the overturning of Roe v. Wade with Dobbs. And it's just human nature. There was a huge argument. You've seen some argument right now about whether or not the pro-life movement wanted to keep Roe v. Wade in place because it's a huge fundraiser for them. If they can continue to say, hey, listen, this is a problem, you got to give us money, it presents a pretty comfortable position for all of the people that are leading the pro-life movement. I don't believe that's true. I work with them. I think their character and morality is above that, but you can see human nature being tempted by something like that. So there's a lot of conversation in the pro-life movement of that we're flat-footed and we don't know where we go from here, and we're losing all of these state battles. So the argument that it has to be left up to the state is not good, but it cannot succeed at the federal level. I'll give you one more illustration. If you need to go. I'll give you one more illustration. Senator Langford, pro-life, he leads the Senate VAT community, which is the Values Action Team. I think Oklahoma has an absolute ban, if I remember right. They have an absolute ban. Right now, the only place Republicans can get any agreement on is 15-week ban. So 15 weeks, you can have abortion up to 15 weeks. After 15 weeks, federally, it will be prohibited. Langford can't vote for that bill because he will be excoriated by Oklahomans to say, how dare you compromise on our absolute ban on abortion and vote for killing babies up to 15 weeks. And so a good man's between a rock and a hard place politically because the people of his state have already spoken about what abortion restrictions will be in their state. So he can vote for nothing less than an absolute ban at the federal level, or else he most likely will get the boot as the senator from Oklahoma. So it's a very difficult political issue right now. So we need a federal ban, but politically it's not possible at this point. And it's blowing up even the Republican Party to talk about it can hardly have conversations in closed-door meetings without them becoming exceptionally contentious. Senator Cruz, too many stories. Senator Cruz, because he's in a really tough election battle, was supporting a IVF bill that was absolutely horrible if you believe life begins at conception. It was not protecting parents or people from being protected from industry people that are making money off of IVF. It was protecting IVF because that was one way that Republicans felt like they could get some traction to say, oh, listen, because the argument is you don't want kids to be aborted, but Republicans hate children, which is stupid, right? But you won't give, and really what they mean is you won't give federal money for the absolute, you won't supplant parents' responsibility to kids with federal government being responsible to clothe them, feed them, educate them, etc. And so you hate kids. And so he tried to sidestep the whole issue in Texas, because it's controversial in Texas, by looking like he was for children by supporting IVF. But he got tore up in closed-door meetings. His staff got tore up. Like, what are you doing? Do you believe life begins at conception or not? What are you thinking? And it's because he felt like that was a necessary political move because he's in the tightest re-election campaign he's ever had in Texas. So that's what I mean by it's fraught with all sorts of levels of bad things and no positive solution in sight right now. Good question, though. That cuts to the heart of exactly what I was trying to say. Thank you. Yeah, I'll be up here if you want to chat. What's next on the agenda?